Professor Karen Winkfield.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, come on, we got to do better than that. If I'm up as a radiation oncology, y'all need to be up. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Meharry, for the invitation once again. I really was telling your wife out there, I was at this time yesterday on a beach in Mexico, so I traveled 12 hours to get here for you, my friend. So, um, yeah, right, yes. Wow, we are not going there, okay? It is too early for that, okay? Let me just say. So thank you all so much for being here and being awake. So great to see some of my great friends and colleagues. And I think that the reason why I decided to take this journey yesterday is because this is a really important topic, and it's something that's near and dear to my heart. I think a lot of times when we think about the DRIVE initiative, remember that I is really about creating that individual plan. And I know that we have a lot of pharmaceutical reps here, so I'm speaking to you as well. I think this also comes from the sponsor's perspective as well. You've got to make sure there's intentionality in terms of how you are actually designing and implementing your studies. That includes where you go. And I will say, as a heme radiation oncologist, I loved working on multiple myeloma. That was one of my favorite things, not because the patients who came to me oftentimes were in pain, right? I did love the fact that I could help them with a little shot of radiation here or there. But if you look at the amount of work that we've been able to accomplish, both from institutional level, but also really collectively, where we came out with 13 different agents over the last 10 years, over 20 different treatments that have changed the face of multiple myeloma. But when you look at the drugs that have been discovered, if you look at those FDA-approved drugs, only 5% of the population included in those studies were Black, despite the fact that 20% of the multiple myeloma population in the US is Black. So my discussion today is really not just around Black-white issues. It's about really how do we ensure that there is the right fit. And I'm so glad to hear that the DRIVE calculator has been updated. I think it is important for geography. One of the things from my perspective is you think about catchment areas. Every single comprehensive cancer center, the NCI cancer centers, have to design what's their area that they're going to serve. And I'm in Tennessee. And even though we are the only NCI designated comprehensive cancer center in Tennessee that serves adults and pediatrics, my catchment area as the associate director of the cancer center includes part of Kentucky and part of Alabama as well. So really, am I going to drive that much change in over 123 counties? Not really. And so what it means is that we have to be intentional. We have to say, what am I really trying to achieve with this particular study? And I will say I was very, very, very spoiled when I was at Mass Gen. So at Mass General Hospital, we had over 400 cancer clinical trials open. And when I had an investigator-initiated trial that I opened, I actually had a research coordinator that was assigned to me. And that research coordinator would send me a message the day before and be like, hey, Dr. Winkfield, by the way, we got 3 patients that are potentially eligible for this trial. Great. So it really took a lot of the onus off of me for screening ahead of time, right? That research coordinator showed up with like folders in hand with each person's name, the consent form all ready to rock. But that's not what happens everywhere. And so again, if you're a sponsor and you want to be inclusive, going to places like Mass Gen may not necessarily be where you need to go. It's one thing if you're being intentional about wanting to accrue quickly. Then yeah, go there, go to MD Anderson, go to these large places. Now some institutions are doing better than others. Part of the challenge where I was when I was at Mass Gen, and even frankly at Vandy, is who walks through the door. Right, so that can be a challenge. And I'm looking at Carmen, because Carmen's done a lot of work even at Penn, kind of thinking about how do you change who walks through the door. So I'll leave that, y'all can talk with her, she's in the red jacket down there, about how you can do that work. But when you think about your particular trial, as an investigator, as a sponsor, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to improve equity? Are you trying to improve the number of individuals who enroll? And this is where it's important to make sure that you're intentional on how to do this, because this is where, that's what's gonna drive your individual plan and strategy, is what you're trying to achieve. And I will say a lot of sponsors necessarily don't think about that. They just wanna kind of crank and get it done. But it's really important, and I love Dr. Schneider, thank you so much, first of all, for talking about Edith, and and Werda. Those are two of my mentors as well, and they're phenomenal. And unfortunately, they both passed away like within months of each other. But I will say, part of their work continues in us. Um, and I think the way that we design trials is really important. You spoke about the importance of making sure that the eligibility criteria are correct, but also making sure that we have the populations that we are hoping to recruit as part of the research enterprise. I've done a lot of work with building and developing advocates for research in medicine. In fact, have a national plan called the Advocates for Research in Medicine program that we actually utilize through the NCORE research basis, the NCI Clinical Oncology Research Program. So I think there are ways to do that. And sponsors, you can do that. Some places, some institutions are doing a really good job of including the patient voice, but I would say that needs to happen more and more, particularly as we're designing new medications. So why is this important? As you know, there really are structural and clinical barriers, as we mentioned, right? So if you have Duffy coat and you have lower white blood cell counts, you're not eligible. And I will say, unfortunately, there are certain populations that get a bad rap. Oh, this is a difficult population, right? Difficult, they're not going to want to enroll in clinical trials. And I will say, when I was in Boston, I did a lot of work with the Black community around their thoughts about clinical research. And I use the term research, not trials, very intentionally. And they're willing. And I will say, I spent a lot of time with Black men in particular on prostate cancer. And they're like, I want to enroll in trials, and I've asked about it, but guess what? I'm not eligible. So the eligibility criteria is really one of those structural and clinical barriers that really need to be overcome, and thinking about how we might be able to design clinical trials differently. And then, of course, there's the physician and the patient decision-making. There is some trust element that needs to be there between the patient and the provider as well, and they need to just be asked, right? One of the most common reasons why people don't enroll in clinical trials is because they're not asked, all right? And so I think that's really, really important to think about. And part of the reason why, again, we really need to be intentional is that there are many, many steps and barriers that can come into play. Again, the structural, barriers. Is a trial even available? And this is where the right sizing of interventions comes to play. If you're a small community oncology practice with only a handful of providers, it may be difficult to open up a very broad clinical trials option. You also have to think about the patients who are walking through your door. Doesn't make sense to open up a clinical trial for sarcoma if that's not what you're treating, right? And so really thinking very creatively about who are the people who are walking through the door. It just means that you have to know, and sometimes I think as providers, that can go over our heads. We don't even think, and we're just kind of in the mode, just cranking. And so this model pathway is really important. Again, thinking about, are the trials even available? Can people even walk through the door? I will say, again, as a health equity person, I didn't ask the question, that's my bad. At Vanderbilt, we don't accept adult Medicaid. So here we are, the only NCI-designated comprehensive cancer center that treats adult and pediatric patients in Tennessee, but we don't accept adult Medicaid. So they can't even walk through the door. That's a clinical access problem. I'm working on that. I actually put together an SBAR and have a carve-out for clinical trial patients, clinical trial eligible patients who are seen at Meharry. But that's just for a very small handful of people. But that's a problem, right? Then again, we already talked about the eligibility requirements, and that's an important clinical barrier that's there. And then from the physician perspective, I think it's really important to make sure that we don't allow our own biases. Oh, this is a difficult population. Oh, this person doesn't speak English, right? Oh, it's going to be more of a challenge. And it may be, but those are the things that we have to be thoughtful about as individuals who have the ability to offer clinical trials. And I think one of the challenges that I'm finding in my role as AD of the Cancer Center is oftentimes we don't even know what the denominator is. How many patients are actually being offered a clinical trial versus those who decline, right? We know how many enroll, but oftentimes we're not collecting the data of this patient was actually approached for a clinical trial and they declined because, right? That oftentimes is difficult. So I think it's really important for us to really be intentional about what is the question that we're trying to answer. Because as you can see, there are a lot of different areas in this pathway where we might need to have an intervention, okay? Again, I think there's a reason why this is important if you think about the fact in cancer, and this is old, like this thing is 10 years old, but it still applies, right, this graphic, where really less than 10% of cancer patients are enrolling in clinical trials. And, a lot of that is just because the first thing is that no trial is available. So over 50% of the patients who potentially could be eligible, they're just not even being offered, right? And so once you go through the eligibility requirements, maybe kind of, I remember I had a sponsor who sent me a protocol. And this is, again, where as providers, as researchers, we can look through these things and look for red flags. If there are major things that could exclude patients, we, as the folks who are going to be the investigators, can say, I think we need to change this eligibility requirement, right? The sponsor had in there, you know, to be eligible, patient had to have a BMI less than 25%. I'm like, I'm sorry, you do know you're in the U.S. You're in the United States of America. That's not going to happen, right? You will never accrue enough patients. So I think those are things, the onus is on us as providers to look at that. And so, again, this is where right sizing is important. So if you are a sponsor who has a multiple myeloma trial, where are you going to get that trial accrued to? Are you going to places where they actually have the patients who could benefit most, right? Are you thinking about just the quick accrual? I think that's important. I do. But there's a way to kind of think also creatively about how do you build capacity at other places, or how do you go to the places where they actually do have the patient population who could fit the demographics that you're interested in. The number of physicians is important too. Like I said, if you have a smaller practice, it's going to be harder to really think about how you can do this. Again, I was very spoiled at Mass Gen because we had an engine, right? And so now at Vandy, even though they also have a pretty good engine, it's a little bit broken. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing is I'm instituting a clinical trial navigation program. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that later. I know we have a Q&A session. But for me, I think that's one way that I can help my, my colleagues to do a little bit better job of really identifying patients before the clinic starts, right? To make sure that we're thinking about that. So it's really important, again, to think about the different sizes and how you right size, and then that plan is going to really come to fruition. We've heard a little bit of talk about social determinants of health, but I will say that one of the challenges in this country is that the healthcare system itself is one of those social determinants of health. It's broken. You have Medicaid. You're differently abled, so you're on Medicaid as an adult, and you can't come to certain cancer centers. It's a problem. My dad lives in Texas, couldn't go to the largest cancer center in the world because he had the wrong type of Medicare, right? So we're so siloed, and I think this is important. This is why we have to think of an individual plan, and we have to right-size it. So how can you do this? How can you as a sponsor, how can you as an investigator, how can you as a clinician, how can you as a pharmacist? What are things that you can do to improve clinical trial enrollment? You can ask. Just ask the questions. Number one, if you're a clinician, you're a provider, you have clinical trials open at your site, ask. I'd like for you to think about this clinical trial, right? Let me tell you what your treatment options are. Here's the standard of care. Here are the other options. And we also have this fantastic opportunity for you to enroll in some research. Don't other it. It's part of standard of care, right? If you're a sponsor, just ask, who are my providers? Where are the study being open, right? What are the demographics? What are the people that we want to include in this study, and do we have the right representation? If you're a pharmacist, go through those eligibility requirements, please, and say, does this make sense? Are these things that are going to exclude patients really needed? Those are the things that we can do. And I think it's also important to think about the fact, again, there are some social determinants of health, and we have to ask people at the point of care too. This is why for sponsors it's really important to include that patient voice when you're designing clinical trials. So you can think about, do I really need that person to come in person and drive 200 miles each way to get a blood draw? Or potentially can they get that blood draw closer to home? How can we think about the patient as we're designing trials, right? And this is where we can be intentional. And a lot of my colleagues don't necessarily want to ask about the social determinants of health, about potentially some of the individual barriers there may be to kind of getting care. But it's important, and we can plan around that. And I know a lot of our pharmaceutical companies are doing a great job of providing ancillary support to our patients so that they can enroll in clinical trials, so that's fantastic. But I'll also say it's important to leverage the community and leverage the community voice and the services. I want to put this up here, 211.org. If you have not heard of that, please write it down because it's a great resource for point of care where you can literally just enter in a patient's zip code and you can find out what services there are. Could be services for rent or food, et cetera. And so it's an important resource, and there are others in the community space. So I just want to leave you with this, the AAA. I always kind of try to leave something with folks, and I think it's important to be aware of what the issues are, aware of what your surroundings are, aware of what you're trying to achieve when it comes to clinical trial enrollment. And then advocacy is important. As I mentioned, there can be some structural barriers that are there that we need to be aware of, and then we have to take action. So it's not just enough to be intentional about how our planning is, but you have to actually do. So I want to thank you so much, and I want to get into a Q&A session, and thank you so much for your attention this morning.